holiday, which it isn't normally. I have to say that's just here in Berlin, not in the rest of Germany, strangely enough. So people in Berlin, I think, will have an extra chance to, commemorate, to think, to visit family members, to visit graves, to talk about it among themselves. What does it mean for them? Well, of course, as I said, Germany now thinks officially of this day as a day of liberation. There are those who still think of it as a defeat, which, of course, it was militarily. We mark this day specifically because this was the date of the capitulation to Allied forces. So I think people think about this, they have it in mind, and they feel that it's important to mark it in some way. We were out on the streets of Berlin yesterday, just gathering some vox pops, some public voices, and we can hear what people had to say there.
You can celebrate it, but after 80 years, you don't have to play that card anymore. The Germans and the war and so on and so forth. I don't feel guilty. My parents don't either. That's a different generation, and by now you could also look at it as a historical fact, but nothing that should be blamed on us anymore.
I hope that something like that never happens again. And the political situation is such that with the AfD there is now a party here where I'm afraid that something could happen again. So I have mixed feelings.
That will never be the case, if only because there is a memory that at least looks like that. But there is still this memory, and it will certainly become weaker over time, because people are dying off. But it's all more than documented.
The culture of remembrance is very, very important, and you can't draw a line under any circumstances. It has to be constantly updated and considered.
So, Simon, very interesting to hear those perspectives from Germany. This year's anniversary obviously coming as a far-right party, which has just been classified as extremist, received around 20% of the vote in the last federal election here in Germany. Does that change the way that people are commemorating this anniversary?
Yeah, I think we have to be circumspect in how we look at that. Clearly, this determination that the AfD is an extremist organisation is something that's happening sort of at a political and judicial level, and doesn't perhaps bleed immediately into the way people see events like this. But certainly the AfD is a party that has repeatedly said, the culture of remembrance and the focus on the Nazi era of Germany has gone too far. It's become too prominent in thinking. Too much time is spent on it in schools. Those kind of things. They are the people who don't stand for today, and official Germany certainly does.
Simon, thank you so much for that. We're going to turn now to that memorial ceremony at the German Bundestag. I understand it has just begun.
Federal President, Ms. Budenbender, Chancellor, President of the Bundesrat, President of the German Constitutional Court, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, colleagues. Berlin in May 1945. The Tiergarten Park was devastated, the Reichstag building was burned. The dome had been burnt out completely. Many of the windows had been barricaded against a storm. Shrapnel in all of the buildings here. And exactly here was where there was a sense of the end approaching. The battling went on for days. In the upper floors, there were Red Army fighters. In the basement, still German soldiers fighting. And the devastation, Germany's darkest chapter, had to do with the decree after 1933 when there was the fire in the Reichstag building. It ended here in this building as well. Like almost no other image, the ruin of the Reichstag stands for the end of the Second World War and for the end of National Socialist terror. The Second World War was the most brutal war in the history of humanity. Almost everywhere in Europe, the German occupiers committed war crimes. In Eastern Europe, they pursued a war of annihilation aiming at eradicating entire peoples. And shortly after the invasion of Poland, the German occupiers deported and murdered tens of thousands of Polish teachers, bishops, and many others. Often, this crime has not been mentioned. In Belarus as well, the German occupiers locked villagers into their homes and threw bombs at them. Even children were burnt alive. In the big cities, the Nazi terror devastated one after another. Leningrad was to be starved more than 2.5 years long. The Wehrmacht cut the people off from any supplies. There were more than 1 million who died in that alone. And then there were piles of bodies of those who had starved, who had frozen, who had died in battle. The incredible scale of Germany's crime is something many of us are still not aware of today, but worse than that, there are many who do not want to engage with what happened then. To counteract this trend is another reason why we commemorate the 8th of May. First and foremost, 1945 was a liberation for those who had suffered the most. The 8th of May brought them liberation in the concentration camps. On the 27th of January, we commemorate all victims of the National Socialists, but just commemorating the Holocaust does not protect us from new anti-Semitism. There are many faces to anti-Semitism, many narratives. While we proclaim never again, it's already happening now on our streets, online, even at universities. If you have a revisionist approach of remembrance, this has to be tackled. If we think back to the past, we have to apply it to the present now. Ladies and gentlemen, Germany planned and waged and executed this war. And millions of Germans in 1945 were fleeing their homes. They had put their belongings on what fit on a cart. It became the symbol of many who were displaced. There were people hiding in the last weeks of the war in their basements, trying to protect themselves from bombs and troops who were approaching, especially the women and the girls. They are often the victims who are neglected and overlooked in every war, because it was the women of all of the peoples who suffered particularly. The world often forgets their silent strength. German President Richard von Weizsäcker referred to them 40 years ago in his speech. Of course, it was the women in the Second World War who were not free of guilt as well, but women and girls suffered sexual violence during the war and often after the war as well. Ladies and gentlemen, let us not forget, many children were born of women affected by this. There's an 82-year-old daughter who wrote to the German parliament, and I'd like to read out what she said. As a witness of the Second World War and a witness of rape, My mother was raped on the border to the Czech Republic when we were driven out. And I would like to ask that on the 80th year at which we commemorate the liberation of Nazi tyranny, that we remember the women who suffered sexual violence during that time and who continue to suffer sexual violence because they are women. Now, her words really touched me. I want to say thank you, Ms. Schulz, for writing your letter to us, and thank you for accepting our invitation to be here today. I would like to welcome you on our tribune today. I want to say thank you for your letter. And you asked when. When would there be an official commemoration of the women who were victims of sexualized violence in war and who continue to be? And the answer, Michon, is today. The suffering of women is something that post-war Germany did not refer to. There were almost no opportunities for them to speak of what had happened to them, and the shame prolonged their suffering. How many broke because of this suffering? It is time to commemorate these women, to give them space, to acknowledge their suffering, and to acknowledge the incredible strength that they had to fight for their survival and to contribute to rebuilding this country. Monika Hauser, the founder of a women's rights organization, described it by saying, the men didn't ask their women, what happened to you during the war? So that the women wouldn't ask, and what did you do in the war? In May 1945, how did these women feel? Did they feel vanquished? Did they feel desperate? Did they feel relieved? Did they feel liberated? In the occupied and then soon divided Germany, very few felt liberated. In East German propaganda, the 8th of May was celebrated as the day of liberation, but at the same time it was used as a justification for new types of oppression. It was only after a complex process of sifting through what had happened in the past were we able to acknowledge this military defeat as liberation. Today, it is still so important to remember the end of this war. And in our regional newspapers, for example, I saw in the Rhein newspaper, the Öffentliche Anzeige, I read memories that the readers had collected. A 98-year-old reader who talked about the simultaneity of all kinds of feelings after liberation. The sense of joy, of fear, of gratitude as a young man to have survived the war at all. Stories like these from the communities across Germany help us to better understand the Nazi tyranny. The 8th of May led to a reorientation to democracy, and it lent its real significance, a democracy in which everyone can contribute. Who would have been able to imagine in 1945 that in the Reichstag building there would once again be a freely elected parliament? What an incredible turnaround in history. The Reichstag building has a good memory, colleagues. Many soldiers 80 years ago wrote the names of the countries they came from. It says Kursk and Leningrad, but also Donbass and Yerevan. The Red Army soldiers didn't just come from Russia, they came from all the different republics of the Soviet Union, including from Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow in Moscow, we will see victory parades once again in the name of the liberators. They will be used to justify the war against Ukraine. This is an abuse of history. Bucha, Mariupol, and many other places again are seeing girls and women being the victims of sexualized violence as a weapon of war. Ladies and gentlemen, many of the people in Germany today are looking at the question of whether war could once again be waged in our country. For a very long time, we thought that peace could not be questioned. But if we are to maintain peace and liberty, we must be able to defend ourselves militarily. And on the 80th anniversary of the end of the war, we need to remember, but we need to be aware of the fact that if we have been liberated, we have an obligation to defend this liberty. And this is the obligation that the 8th of May leaves us with. Thank you. And now I am very pleased that 3 young people have accepted our invitation. They're going to be reading brief texts from contemporary writers. These are young people who volunteer for the German War Graves Commission. And I want to thank Tancred Zuckau, Sophia Wegener, and Karl Wittek. I'm pleased that you're here today, and I'm glad that you volunteer.
Aus der Chronik, uns geht's ja noch Gold, von Walter Kempowski.
From the German Chronicle, We Are Still Doing Fine by Walter Kempowski. When I leant out of the window, I could see everything. Opposite Paulsstraße, the fire had reached after the disaster, where that's what people called it after 1942. They talked about before the catastrophe and after the catastrophe. Now it will be before the collapse and after the collapse. I was on the sofa and had the windows open. There were white flags hanging out of all of the buildings, as if these were all bunkers that had surrendered. Opposite, the workers' Kranke had a red flag. At the corner, there was a motorbike with Russians. They were joking with an Eastern worker. Come away from the window, my mother called. Otherwise, you'll draw attention to us. Have they gone? No, the Russians were still there. What was going to happen next? We managed to survive this far. We hadn't been bombed, and we were still alive. And Daddy, well, we didn't know. Hopefully, he would come back all right as well. We just had to wait and drink tea in the meantime. But Russians, who would have believed it? Couldn't have the English have come here faster? It was only a few kilometers. How good that we lived on the 2nd floor. If there really were Russians who were coming up the building, they would have to go past Becker's empty flat, and then they could plunder everything there, and hopefully they wouldn't have to go any further. The motorbike drove off, and the noise had been unbearable anyway. I put a white handkerchief on my sleeve and went out on the street. Don't go too far, my mother said. And then at Friedrich Franz Street, there was a dead horse lying there. It was from the Wehrmacht. There were 2 old men who were near it. They were cutting the meat out of it. They cut the meat from the thighs. They were going to make a goulash, but you had to put a lot of herbs and spices in it, they said, or it would take sweet. There was a Soviet soldier who had a balalaika on his stomach, and there was a long chain, a convoy of vehicles coming. There was a tank soldier who didn't look to the left, didn't look to the right. None of them did. They had no time. And there was a fence as well.
Der in Kempowskis Roman angesprochene Fatih ist längst tot.
Daddy, that Kempowski refers to in his books, has long died, but his descendants thought they would survive a long time. They thought he would come back. My name is Tancred Zucker. I'm 25 years old. There's no guilt on my shoulders for what happened in the Second World War, but we still bear responsibility. My encounters in the international peace projects have shown that these encounters can lead to reconciliation and even friendship if we take on the responsibility that we all bear.
Darauf hoffe ich.
And I hope we all will.
Aus dem Buch Weiterleben, eine
From the
Jugend
book
von
Keep Living, A Youth
Die
by
Zeit unserer
Ruth
Flucht war die
Kluger.
Zeit der letzten,
The time
schwersten
where we were
Bomben.
fleeing our homes were the times of the
Deutschland
worst
war ein
bombing.
geschundenes Land. Es
Germany
war zum
was a
geschundenen
beaten country.
Schiffler geworden. Die großen Städte standen
The
in Flammen.
biggest cities were in
Überall wurde
flames.
bombardiert und
There was
fielen
bombing
Flugblätter,
everywhere.
welche die
And
Bevölkerung
there were
aufforderten, sich zu ergeben
flyers that were
oder
being
den Nazis
distributed
Widerstand zu leisten.
asking the
Nichts
people to
hätte
fight
weniger
against the
überzeugen können
Nazis
als
or
dieses
surrender.
Sprechen. Abgeworfen von den verhassten,
The flyers
kreischenden
were
Todesmaschinen.
thrown
Die
by these
Leute
death
legten die
machines.
Blätter verächtlich
People
beiseite.
threw
Auch als
these
die
flyers
wenigsten
away
mehr an die
contemptuously,
Ende Wunder waren
even though
geglaubt.
hardly anyone still believed there would
Und
be
eines
a
Tages
final
waren sie
victory.
da, die
And one day
Das Wetter war
they
schön,
were
es war
there.
Frühling
It was
geworden.
nice
Sie
weather,
hatten die
it was
Stadt
spring.
eingenommen, indem
They
sie
had
mit ihren
occupied the
Panzern und
city
Jeeps
with their
vorantrieben.
tanks
Es
and
hatte
with their
keine
jeeps.
Schlacht gegeben.
There was
Der
no
lange
battle for
Fluch,
these
der mein Leben
cities.
gewesen war, diese
For a
7
long
bösen
time,
Jahre,
these 7
waren mit
evil
einem Mal
years
vorbei.
were suddenly over. They had defined my life for
Wir
7 whole
waren am
years.
Ziel.
We had
Wir hatten nie
reached
weiter
the end.
geplant, als
We had
bis
never
zu
planned
diesem
any
Moment.
further
Wir gingen
than to
in das
this date.
Stadtzentrum, sahen
We
einander
went into the heart
verdutzt an und
of the
fragten
city,
uns, was
looked at
nun?
one another
Meine Mutter
confusedly
nahm
and
ihr
said, "What
bestes
now?"
Schulenglisch zusammen,
My
ging auf
mother
den ersten besten amerikanischen
tried to
Soldaten
use
zu
her
und
school
erzählte
English,
ihm
approached an
kurz und
American
bündig,
soldier,
wir seien
and briefly
aus
said
einem
that
entlaufen.
we
Was
had
er
run away from a
antwortete,
concentration
verstand ich nicht,
camp.
weil ich noch kein
I
Englisch
didn't
konnte.
understand what he
Aber
said
seine
back because I
Gebärde
didn't
war
understand any English, but it was clear
legte
what
die
his
Hände
body
an
language
beide
was
Ohren
saying.
an
He
und
put
wandte sich ab.
his hands
Meine
on
Mutter übersetzte.
both of his
Genug
ears
von
and
den
turned
Leuten,
away.
die behaupteten, sie
My
seien
mother
in den Lagern
translated and
gewesen.
said he
Man
was sick
treffe
of
sie
hearing people had been in
überall an.
concentration
Wir
camps.
waren
We
schon
met
wieder
them
weg.
everywhere. And here were some more
Die
who had
Aprilsonne
come
wärmte
out
mir
of the
die
concentration
Haut. Ich
camps.
konnte von jetzt
The
an
April
Kurzärmel
sun
tragen. Und zwar
had
egal, ob jemand
given me a
die KZ
tan
Nummer
already,
bemerkte.
and
Auch bei
I
meinem
wanted my
richtigen
arms
Namen
to be
durfte
tanned,
ich
even though you
wieder
could see
nennen.
my
Ein
concentration
unvergessener
camp
Tag
number.
wird es
I could say
bleiben.
my name again.
Doch ich war
It was
froh,
a
dass wir uns
day I
selbst
would never
befreit
forget.
hatten
But
und
I
von
was
den
grateful
Siegern
that
nicht mehr viel
we
brauchten.
had
Denn für die
liberated ourselves and
herbeigesehnte
didn't need
und in
much from the
meiner Fantasie zu einem
victors,
großen Fest
because
hochstilisierte
I
Stunde der
thought
Befreiung,
this
was in
hour of
etwas
liberation would be an hour
spärlich
of huge ceremony, but it was a little bit sparse. Here was my first American, and he put his hands over his ears. So one thing was for sure. They hadn't fought for us in this war. My name is Sophia Wegener. I'm 21 years old, and Ruth Kluger's text showed me how important identity is. With just a few strokes, She was reduced to being a number. And after all of the persecution she experienced, she managed to get her dignity and her liberty back. If your great-grandmother knew that you were interested in that, this was the response of my family when I said I wanted to get involved in the culture of remembrance. But for me, it's important that we remember the dangers of tyranny. We must never forget them.
Am 1. Januar
On the 1st of January 1945, Thomas Mann spoke in the radio. There will be no Nazi victory. Everything that looks like that is complete nonsense. These people are living in incomprehensible madness. And through the resistance of the Allies, there could be a negotiated peace or a forced peace. Peace forced by Russia and the Allies. Do you believe there will be a peace where the Nazi regime will prevail? It's impossible. The world needs peace. And so the National Socialism that has never had any purpose but war, who never wanted anything but war, is no use to this world. Never have the interests of the people and its regime been further apart than they are with you Germans. The people who want peace and want to rebuild their lives, and there you have the regime who want war and only war. And they will hang Germany. Germany will never be allowed to rebuild itself with the Nazis in power. On the 8th of May 1945, Thomas Mann wrote, "Germany has surrendered," a statement to the German people. The superiority of the opponent have forced you to give up your weapons. Let Germany be quiet and begin a new life. And I meant this honestly. This is a solemn day. I am not experiencing a sense of celebration among the German people. Of course, the German government is an instrument of surrender. But this is being done with Germany, not in Germany. And there's no denial now of the Nazi period. No word that allowing the Nazis to achieve power was a terrible, terrible thing. The commitment to justice, to humanity, where am I seeing people committing to this? My name is Karl Wittek. I'm 19 years old. Before the war was over, Thomas Mann was talking about how important peace was. But when the war was over, he says there's no sense of celebration. I'm thinking about my grandparents. They were glad that the war ended, but the war had taken their home and nearly all of their relations, although they never talked about it very much. The war defined the history of my family. As a volunteer, I am working to try to ensure that people never forget war, so that we learn something from the fates of those who had to experience it, and in the hope that we can live in peace in the future.
So what we've heard there, extracts from writings about the time, about the end of the war, from Walter Kempowski, from Ruth Kluger, and from Thomas Mann, of course, the Nobel Prize winner who famously, from his exile in America, broadcast to Germans to tell them that there was no chance of peace or victory for the Nazis. And now we're going to hear a piece of music, Dmitri Shostakovich's String Quartet No. 8, a piece dedicated to the victims of fascism and war. So that was the fifth movement from Dmitri Shostakovich's String Quartet number 8, written in 1960. And now we will hear the address from Germany's federal president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier.
Du weißt ja, wir haben immer damit gerechnet.
You know, we always knew it could happen, but it's still hard to bear when defeat is actually upon you. Ladies and gentlemen, defeat is hard to bear, wrote Helga Felmy, born in 1911, on the 8th of May 1945, to her husband, a pastor, who was a prisoner of war. The letter is one of the documents collected by Walter Kempowski on the German state of mind at the end of the war. President of the Bundestag, Chancellor, President of the Bundesrat, President of the Constitutional Court, MPs, guests, fellow citizens. Germany lay in ruins on the 8th of May 1945, the day of unconditional surrender. Cities had been transformed into endless wastelands, with only mountains of rubble and skeletons of walls still standing instead of buildings. The odd building that was still standing by sheer random chance towered over the devastation, like memorials. Bridges blown up by the Wehrmacht were a symbol of a war fanatically waged to the point of utter self-destruction. Entire regions had been devastated. Berlin has ceased to exist, reported BBC reporter Thomas Cadet back home. We have all seen countless images of that day. German soldiers disarmed by Allied forces squatting with their arms crossed behind their heads. Their faces now fearful, blank, lost. Survivors staggering like the undead through the ruins of bombed-out cities. The corpses of those for whom liberation came just days too late. Images of shot-up carts carrying refugees fleeing from the east, surrounded by scattered clothing and the remnants of their belongings. The Second World War was nothing but endless horror, humiliation, persecution, torture, murder, genocide. In the end, more than 60 million people in Europe were dead. 6 million Jewish people murdered. Millions were homeless, orphans, broken, wounded, starving. And yet, there was also hope and gratitude. We are repeatedly filled with a great sense of relief and gratitude that we have truly survived all of these dangers. This monstrosity, wrote Victor Klemperer, still almost incredulous in the final days of the war. This brilliant scholar, humiliated, disenfranchised, and persecuted, could finally hope to have escaped his own destruction. It was Germans who unleashed this criminal war and dragged the whole of Europe into the abyss. It was Germans who committed the crime against humanity that was the Shoah. And it was Germans who were unwilling and unable to throw off the yoke of the Nazi regime by themselves. And we remember this today, we Germans, 80 years later. We know that this day has left a deep mark on our country. We are all children of the 8th of May. Ladies and gentlemen, on the 8th of May 1945, we were liberated. Today, 80 years later, we remain deeply grateful to the Allied soldiers and the European resistance movements who defeated the Nazi regime at the cost of enormous effort, and many paid with their lives, and we will never forget. We are grateful to the Americans, the British, the French, and all of those who fought alongside them against Nazi terror. We also know what sacrifice the Red Army made. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and all of those who fought in the Red Army ranks, at least 13 million of these soldiers. And at least as many civilians lost their lives. It was the Red Army that liberated Auschwitz, and we have not forgotten that. But this is precisely why we resolutely oppose the Kremlin's lies about history today, even if these claims are repeated again tomorrow during the victory celebrations in Moscow. The war against Ukraine is not a continuation of the fight against fascism. Putin's war of aggression, his campaign against a free, democratic country, has nothing in common with the fight against Nazi tyranny in the Second World War. At the end of the day, this historical lie is nothing but whitewashing of imperial delusions, grave injustices, and most serious crimes, even on the 8th of May, and especially on this day. We support Ukraine in its fight for freedom, democracy, and sovereignty. To leave Ukraine unprotected and defenseless would be to abandon the lessons of the 8th of May, ladies and gentlemen. Today, 80 years later, we are also deeply grateful for the reconciliation and trust that so many countries have extended to us after the war, for the reconciliation with our neighbors, Poland and France, for the miracle of reconciliation that Jewish communities around the world and the State of Israel have bestowed upon us. We Germans cannot be grateful enough for this gift of reconciliation. And yet, gratitude is not enough. We can never and must never turn a blind eye when anti-Semitism rears its ugly head in our country of all places. It is a betrayal of history, and it is intolerable. Intolerable when Jewish people no longer feel safe in our country. But it's not just intolerable for Jewish people. No, it is intolerable for our democracy. There can be no place for anti-Semitism in our society. It is our duty to ensure this, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1945, liberation came from outside of Germany. It had to come from outside. Most Germans remained loyal to the Nazi regime until the very last day. And far from all Germans felt gratitude for their liberation at this time. They didn't even see themselves as being liberated. On the 8th of May, 1945, our country embarked on a long journey towards freedom and democracy. The Western Allies paved the way for the people in what was then West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. In East Germany, however, the people continued to be denied their freedom, and the Soviet Union paved the way for the one-party rule of the SED and a new dictatorship. But we Germans also had to free our minds in what was a long and painful process. It was a process of critically engaging with the past that left painful scars, including between generations. The truth is that although anti-fascism was state doctrine in the German Democratic Republic, in East Germany, there was no in-depth examination of history for a very long time there. It is also true, however, that West Germany, the young Federal Republic of Germany, initially refused to confront the past in any meaningful way, especially when it came to punishing the perpetrators. Instead, many people who had been loyal servants of the Nazi regime were appointed to new offices. In both East and West Germany, it took years, even decades, before we Germans comprehensively addressed the agonizing questions of guilt and responsibility, before families talked about what their family members had done, who had known about the crimes and yet turned a blind eye, who had been guilty and yet remained silent. Richard von Weizsäcker's statement, the 8th of May was a day of liberation, in his historic speech on the 8th of May 1985, was still controversial 40 years after the end of the war. And yet it marked a turning point in the way we deal with our past. President von Weizsäcker spoke for West Germany, but his words also resonated in East Germany. And today, another 40 years later, the 8th of May has become the core of our unified German identity as a day of liberation. And yet, we cannot commemorate this 8th of May today with quiet self-assurance, for we sense that freedom is not the grand finale of history. Freedom is not guaranteed for all time. Today, therefore, we no longer need to ask, did the 8th of May liberate us? We know the answer to that, and it remains valid. But what we have to ask is, how can we remain free? Ladies and gentlemen, 80 years after the end of the war, the long 20th century has finally come to an end. Ivan Krastev writes, the lessons learned from 2 dictatorships and 2 world wars are fading. The liberators of Auschwitz have become new aggressors. With the war against Ukraine, Putin has shattered our European security order, a lesson we had hoped we had learned once and for all from the horrors of war, but it is all in tatters. The international community as a whole has drawn conclusions from the war of annihilation and genocide, introduced rules to curb nationalisms, to promote cooperation between nations, has created an international order based on international law. It's true that all of this was never perfect or uncontroversial, but the fact that the United States of all countries, which played such a decisive role in shaping this new order, is now turning its back on it, is a shock of unprecedented proportions. It is nothing less than a double break with history. Russia's war of aggression and America's betrayal of these values, that is what marks the end of this long 20th century. The fascination with authoritarianism and populist siren calls are gaining ground here in Europe as well, unfortunately. Doubts about democracy are growing louder in many European countries. We are alarmed to see that even the world's oldest democracy can quickly come under threat when the judiciary is undermined, the separation of powers is abolished, academic freedom is under attack. And we look at our own country, ladies and gentlemen, we look at our own country where extremist forces are on the rise. Forces that mock the institutions of democracy and those who represent them. They are poisoning our debates. They are playing on people's fears. They are trading in fear and pitting people against one another, and in this manner they are reviving old evil spirits. MPs, ladies and gentlemen, anyone who wants what is best for this country must protect our coexistence, our cohesion, and the peaceful balance of interests within it. Ladies and gentlemen, I expect this of all Democrats in this country. MPs, how can we remain free? How can we preserve and protect our democracy in the midst of this epochal change that I have spoken about, this break with history? There can be no routine in remembrance. The 8th of May still has much to say to us about remembrance. In fact, I am sometimes stunned at the doggedness with which some people, unfortunately including some in this Parliament, demand that we draw a line under our history and under our responsibility. I am stunned that some say remembrance is a cult of guilt. I mean, what does that actually mean? Does that mean we should forget what we know? And what would we gain from that? Do we really want to deny our solidarity with the survivors of the Holocaust, who are deeply worried today? Do we want to be a country that only remembers supposedly glorious times and downplays or completely denies the darkest chapters of its history? Do we want to be a democracy that forgets where it comes from and what makes up the core of its identity? And, ladies and gentlemen, conversely, do we really want to forgo the experience that fanatical nationalism can be overcome? Do we want to forgo the experience that war can be followed by peace, that peace and democracy can bring prosperity, that critically engaging with our history has earned us recognition and respect throughout the world? Would we really be better off if we forgot all these experiences and simply discarded our memories like an old piece of clothing? Over the past 80 years, we have been allowed to repeatedly experience the power of shared memory, the experience of the Second World War, suffering, destruction, persecution, terror, death, and fleeing. They have become, despite the passing of time, deeply engraved in the collective memory of Europeans. These experiences are passed down from generation to generation in families in France, Britain, Belgium, Italy, and the countries of Eastern Europe. Rabignan, Mazzabotto. And I experience this again and again at commemorative ceremonies when survivors and relatives of Nazi victims tell me of their pain and still extend their hand to me in reconciliation. I was deeply moved when, during the commemoration of the uprising in Warsaw 8 years ago, a survivor took me by the hand and said to me, "Poland and Germany are friends today." I could never have imagined that. What I'm trying to say, ladies and gentlemen, is that there is so much we can achieve through reconciliation, so much that we have already achieved. My request to you, MPs, is let us continue to work towards this goal.
It
is precisely because we have remembered that after 1945, a new, united Europe emerged from the ruins of the Second World War, a Europe having learned lessons from the cataclysm, peaceful coexistence instead of hostile confrontation, cooperation instead of lawlessness, respect for international law and universal human rights. All of this brought us decades of peace, freedom and prosperity. I firmly believe that those who face up to the past are not renouncing the future. Our history is not a prison in which we are locked up. It is not a burden, not even for those of us who were born after the war. On the contrary, with all of its ups and downs, it is a huge, precious wealth of experience. It is the key for us, for our children, for our grandchildren, to overcome the crises of the present day and perhaps those of the future. And that is why it is so important, especially today, to pass on the experience of dictatorship and war, but also that of reconstruction and reconciliation from generation to generation. Why should we have to painfully experience or learn again what we have already experienced and learned in such a bitter way in our German history once before? I'm convinced today more than ever that we've learned so much from our history that has made us who we are today. Let us not recklessly throw away what has made us strong. Let us not flee from our history. Let us not throw its lessons overboard, especially in times when they demand something of us. Ladies and gentlemen, that would be cowardly. That would be wrong. I'm convinced of that. To take this a step further, let me ask, with our history and our experiences, are we not particularly well equipped to tackle the challenges of our time? We cannot stumble sleepwalking through these times. We know where isolationism, aggressive nationalism, and contempt for democratic institutions lead. That is how we lost our democracy in Germany once before. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us trust in our experiences. Let us stand up for our values. Let us not be paralyzed by fear. Let us show determination. When others succumb to nationalism and seek to impose their interests by brute force, let us work all the harder with our partners to find solutions, because it is simply the right thing to do. When others question the United Nations and violate international law, let us stand by it, because it's the right thing to do. Where the zeitgeist extols disruption, let us recognize that is often merely something that hides an unwillingness to describe the path and the goal of change ahead. But we know that lawlessness is not the way forward, and this is particularly true for the relationship between states. We know that the price we will have to pay if we abandon our future to lawlessness, where the rule of law no longer applies and the law of the jungle returns in all of its brutality, that cannot and must not be our path. And if others restrict democracy, freedom and the rule of law, let us defend them all the more. Even if doubts about them grow in our country, let us show that every single person can live a better, freer life in a democracy than in any authoritarian system. Let us convince as many of those who doubt this as possible. Let us win them back for our democracy. Democracy is a work that's never finished, and it's hard work. It demands commitment, but there is no better system, ladies and gentlemen.
Und, verehrte Abgeordnete, wenn
And
neue Kriege uns
MPs,
heute
if
Sorgen
new
machen,
wars are causing us concern today, then we, of all people, must not lose sight of peace. We know where war leads. We are right to fear it. And that is why peace must remain our goal. But peace does not simply prevail because we hold back and refrain from strengthening our own defenses, for we are confronted with a harsh reality. We must do everything we can, together with our European partners, to stop Putin's land grabbing. We must show that democracies are not defenseless victims. We must become stronger militarily, but not to wage war, rather to prevent war, not to replace diplomacy, but to make it more credible, with an active foreign policy that does not leave diplomacy to those who are only pursuing their own selfish power interests. Wherever we can be of use, ladies and gentlemen, we have a duty to get involved. Germany is needed to work for peace, where peace has been lost. That, too, is the mission entrusted to us by the 8th of May. On this 8th of May, ladies and gentlemen, we are a different country than we were 80 years ago and even 40 years ago. We are a country that has been blessed with the great fortune of peaceful revolution and reunification, a diverse country, an open country. Our history does not just provide us with a blueprint for preventing disaster, it also tells us about the miracle of reconciliation between Germany and Israel and how Jewish life was able to become part of our country once again. It tells us how the people of Eastern Europe and East Germany in 1989 overcame the division of Europe and won their freedom. It tells us the incredible success story of a country that after total collapse, including total moral collapse, achieved freedom, economic strength and prosperity, and earned international respect and even sympathy. Who would have thought all of this possible on the 8th of May 1945? Ladies and gentlemen, we may trust this country. We can trust this country and we can trust ourselves. We are all children of the 8th of May, as Jürgen Habermas said, a sentence that inspires hope, defiant hope. Hope against all odds. No one from outside can give us freedom today. We have to stand up for it ourselves. We know what needs to be done, and we know that something new can always emerge. Yes, we are all children of the 8th of May. Let us protect our freedom. Let us protect our democracy. Thank you.
And after the Federal President's address, we will hear the German national anthem and the European anthem.
And you've been watching the German Parliament commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe. And we do have DW's political correspondent Simon Young still here with me in the studio. We've been watching the commemorations together. And Simon, I'd like to just start with your general impressions of what we've witnessed today.
Well, it was a very solemn and dignified ceremony, wasn't it? And in particular, that long address by the President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who, of course, sort of stands above politics, even though he's standing there in the Parliament building today. His job on a day like this is to sort of tell the nation's story and explain to people, German history, complex as it is. And that's, I think, what he did. He told that story from the ruined Germany of the 8th of May, the end of the Second World War, the sort of despair, the suffering that had been unleashed by Germany across Europe with ramifications around the world. And he sort of spun that story through the chapters of reconciliation and of understanding at the building of the European Union and Europe as we see it today, the international world order with the United Nations and international law. And that was the positive side of the story he told. But then I think very strikingly, he also mentioned the threats to the legacy, if you like, of the 8th of May. Particularly, he made clear that he was naming Vladimir Putin and his illegitimate war against Ukraine as a direct attack on democracy. But he also referred to attacks against the international order and against essentially democratic traditions coming from the United States. He didn't put a name on that. He also talked about those who won't learn the lessons of history, the important lessons of the 8th of May, won't learn a lesson of solidarity and understanding in society. And there I think he was talking about those on the political right here in Germany particularly. So he drew all of those strands together I thought what was particularly striking was when he said that Germany perhaps is the country that's particularly well equipped to meet those challenges because we know very particularly from this vantage point here, specifically in Berlin, what it means when you go down the wrong path and you deviate from solidarity and peace and democracy.
And because of its memory culture, which, as you say, he was able to spin together as part of this commemoration, right?
Yeah, he used that phrase a couple of times. We are all children of the 8th of May, and I think what he meant was that there is a common sense of suffering felt in Germany. It's not something that's very much concentrated on, but I mean it's worth bearing in mind there are still more than 1 million German soldiers whose remains have not been discovered, or families are still searching and would like to know details about those. Now, of course, the emphasis is always, and rightly, on the suffering caused to others by Germany, the Shoah, the Holocaust, the 6 million Jews who were murdered, but also the millions of dead. Interestingly and importantly, the president mentioned I think it's 27 million Soviet citizens who lost their lives in the Second World War. All of that, stands front and centre. But there's also pain, of course, for Germans in many German families. And I think, that is the pain. And to say we are children of the 8th of May is to say the tradition born from that pain and that legacy of the end of the war, the liberation of Germany by the Allies, that is, as it were, as Frank-Walter Steinmeier sees it at least, that is the lesson that we should learn. And he said, we mustn't forget. The point is we've got a good tradition. We must go on learning the lesson. We must go on reasserting our freedom and our democracy. And it's a profoundly emotional point, I think, on a day like this.
It was. And Steinmeier in a ceremonial role as German president, as you pointed out, but of course difficult to unpick much of the historical antecedents that he was sharing from modern-day politics and what implications they have on the world that Germans live in today. And you mentioned the case of Russia, Steinmeier, in his speech there. Of course, the Bundestag excluding Russia, we should say, from these commemorations. And Steinmeier acknowledging them as liberators at the time, and he said, but they've turned aggressors. Were you surprised to hear them receive so much time and attention in this speech?
Well, I'm really not, because I think, as I said, what he's saying is we must actively learn the lessons, we must implement the lessons. It's not enough to, just go through the routines, as it were, of remembering and being grateful. We must actively understand them. And you're right, there is a political dimension to what he was saying. He talked about peace doesn't come from the failure to defend ourselves. So that was about as directly political he got. Of course, there has been a big debate. How far should Germany go down the road of building up its armed forces? Its defence forces. Of course, it's not to do with launching any kind of aggressive war and revitalising that tradition. The point is to be defenders of peace, and the president saying there clearly that he thinks that is the right way to go. That is, after all, current government policy. But of course, it's also a contentious issue because there are many things competing for interest here. I think it's right and appropriate that the president should focus on Russia. As you say, the Russian and Belarusian ambassadors were not invited to this ceremony. Ambassadors from many other countries were, including Ukraine. But of course, also Steinmeier said, let's not forget those Red Army soldiers from the Soviet Union. Many Russians, many Belarusians, and many Ukrainians died. They gave their lives for the fight against Nazism. And that is something that Germany is also commemorating today. And he talked about a double break in the epochs, which I think is almost saying, there's a link between the attack by Russia against Ukraine, that's what he mentioned, and the break in values committed by the United States. He didn't give nearly as much detail on that, but he did when he spoke about a double sort of change in the epochs. He sort of put them together. And so this is in sum, this speech was a real, both a piece of history, a history lesson, telling the story, but also explaining what he thinks we should understand from it. And I think it'll be studied, actually, in years to come.
And one of those elements that you've already pointed toward is Steinmeier warning against extremist forces on the rise. Can you contextualize for us how that comes into play in today's Germany? Well,
of course, one can't talk about that subject without mentioning the AfD, the Alternative for Germany party. And that is a party that's highly controversial, particularly its attitude, I think, to the culture of remembrance. And that's what, after all, we're talking about today. They have often said things like, remembrance has gone too far. Some of their members have objected, for instance, to the fact that there's a huge Holocaust memorial right in the centre here of the German capital, Berlin, just a few metres from the Brandenburg Gate. They somehow think that's an offence that stands in contrast to what they would like to think of as the glorious traditions of the German past. And some of them indeed go so far as to be apologists for Nazism. And
Simon, thank you so much for your insights here, but I'm afraid that's actually all we have time for in our news show. You've been watching DW's special coverage as Germany commemorates the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe.
The Soviet Union's secret lunar plan.